In the bitter winter of 1847, the quiet town of Millbrook, Kentucky, stumbled upon a discovery that would stain the Ohio River Valley's memory for generations. Beneath the dignified brick facade of the Sullivan Medical Institute, an institution trusted by farmers, merchants, and rivermen alike, lay a hidden network of cold stone chambers. Inside them rested the preserved remains of more than 60 souls, men, women, and children who had simply vanished from the community over the past 15 years. The investigators who descended into those chambers found more than bodies. They found order. They found intent. On shelves and in cabinets lay bound journals, each page bearing the precise, almost artistic handwriting of Dr. Cornelius Sullivan. The entries described procedures no civilized physician would dare attempt on a living human being. Techniques that blurred the line between surgical precision and cruelty. What unsettled the authorities most was not merely the depravity of the experiments, but the unsettling truth that many victims had first come to Sullivan seeking relief for the most ordinary of complaints: headaches, sour stomachs, sleepless nights. These were ailments that should never have demanded the radical, almost fantastical interventions recorded in those pages. And yet, the Kentucky State Medical Board, perhaps fearing what the full story might do to the public's faith in the profession, quietly buried its official report. For nearly 2 centuries, the depth of Sullivan's work remained sealed in dusty archives, the key turned firmly in the lock. But before we trace the shadowy path that led to those chambers, you must understand who Cornelius Sullivan was and why Millbrook had welcomed him so completely. The Sullivan name had been tied to healing in this town almost since its founding in 1823. Millbrook itself sat tucked into a graceful bend of the Ohio River, a little jewel that steamboats would brush past on their way south, loading cargoes of tobacco and grain, bound for the wharves of New Orleans. By 1832, it was home to nearly 800 residence farmers who coaxed life from the fertile bottomlands, merchants with polished counters and weathered river workers whose arms bore the mark of decades on the current. The people of Millbrook were proud of their courthouse, its brick walls warm in the sun. Proud of their Methodist church, whose steeple rose higher than any for 50 miles. And most proud of their medical institute. When Dr. Cornelius Sullivan arrived in 1831, he seemed to them the embodiment of progress. He was in his early 40s, his silver-streaked hair lending him both distinction and authority. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had studied in Philadelphia and Edinburgh, and the crates he brought with him, filled with gleaming surgical instruments and thick medical texts, were treasures most frontier doctors could scarcely imagine. Within months, Sullivan had opened the Sullivan Medical Institute, a grand 3-story brick building on Main Street. It held private patient rooms, a modern surgical theater, and tucked away in its basement, what he called his research laboratory. The townspeople marveled at his methods. Where the traveling doctors clung to bloodletting and purges, Sullivan spoke of anatomy, of the delicate threads of the nervous system, of what he termed direct neural intervention. He treated cases other physicians pronounced hopeless and often invited patients to remain under his care for weeks. His successes became the talk of the valley. Chronic pain melted away. Restless minds grew calm. Strange fevers vanished as if chased by his very presence. He lived quietly above the institute with his teenage daughter Margaret, a pale, reserved girl who assisted him in his work but was seldom seen beyond its walls. Sullivan explained when pressed that his wife had died years earlier in a yellow fever outbreak in New Orleans, and that his relentless devotion to medicine was born of his inability to save her. The people of Millbrook respected his grief. They admired his mission. What they did not question, what perhaps they did not want to question, was why so many of his most remarkable recoveries involved strangers, travelers, laborers from other counties, troubled souls with no family nearby. People whose disappearance would stir no great alarm. The first true tremor of suspicion came in the autumn of 1846. Thomas Ricks, a respected tobacco merchant, visited Sheriff Benjamin Carmichael with a quiet but urgent concern. His younger brother Robert had been suffering fierce headaches and bouts of confusion ever since falling from his horse that spring. Dr. Sullivan, confident as always, had prescribed a 2-week program at the institute, assuring the family that Robert would leave his care fully cured. That was 6 weeks ago. Sheriff Hendricks said, his voice rough with fatigue, his weathered hands trembling against the brim of his hat. Every time I ask about Robert, Dr. Sullivan says the treatment is going well, but I haven't been allowed to see him. Not once. He says the therapy needs complete isolation from family influence. Sheriff Benjamin Carmichael, a pragmatic man with decades of friendship to the Hendricks family, felt a slow, unwelcome knot forming in his chest. He decided not to send another polite letter, but to walk through the doors of the Sullivan Medical Institute himself. It was a grey November morning when he arrived without warning. He found Dr. Sullivan seated at his desk, a pool of lamplight illuminating the tidy stacks of patient files he was reviewing. The physician greeted him with the same polished courtesy he gave everyone, explaining that Robert was resting comfortably but still far too delicate for visitors. "I understand your concern," Sheriff Sullivan said evenly. "But premature contact could undo months of progress. The mind is a fragile instrument. It must be recalibrated with care. Perhaps in another week. 2 at most." Carmichael might have accepted that, if not for what he glimpsed beyond the half-open door. Margaret Sullivan was mopping the hall near the basement steps. The water in her bucket swirled with a murky reddish-brown tint, something that looked far too much like dried blood diluted into rust. The sharp sting of fly clung to the air, but it could not mask another odor, a heavier, sweeter scent that seemed to rise from the stone floor below. Decay. That evening, unable to let the matter rest, the sheriff returned. No formal knock, no polite greeting, just the quiet tread of boots around the institute's darkened exterior. The building looked deserted save for a weak amber glow leaking from the basement windows. Moving to the rear, Carmichael found a small ground-level pane set into the foundation. Kneeling, he peered through. What he saw would follow him into every dream thereafter. Dr. Sullivan stood over an examination table. The leather apron across his chest darkened with blood. His gloved hands moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, opening what could only be human flesh. Around him, shelves and benches groaned under the weight of glass vessels, each cradling preserved organs, suspended in pale liquid. Anatomical charts, hand-drawn with meticulous detail, papered the walls. Beyond the lamp's circle of light, more tables emerged from the shadows. Each held a still figure beneath a white sheet. And on the table, before Sullivan, lay a body with unmistakable features, a shock of red hair, a solid, familiar build. Robert Ricks, When Carmichael shared what he had seen, the news raced through Millbrook like fire on dry grass. But the reaction was not the outrage he had expected. Instead, whispers of doubt took root. "Thomas Ricks has been hitting the bottle since his brother disappeared," murmured Mrs. Adelaide Prescott, the banker's wife, to her friends. And everyone knows Sheriff Carmichael's had it in for Dr. Sullivan ever since the cholera outbreak last summer. Even when summoned before a hastily gathered town council, Dr. Sullivan's demeanor never wavered. He expressed confusion hurt even over the allegations. He claimed his basement work involved cadavers, legally purchased from Louisville medical colleges. Robert, he said, gravely had died from a sudden brain fever despite all efforts. The body had been preserved, awaiting the proper moment to notify the family. Yes, he admitted, he had delayed delivering the news, holding on to the hope that his findings could still lead to a breakthrough, sparing others from the same fate. "Gentlemen," Sullivan told the council, his voice low, with what seemed like genuine grief, "I understand how this might appear to those unfamiliar with modern medicine. But every incision I've made, every procedure I've attempted, has been to expand our understanding. Because conventional methods have failed far too many. In the end, the council voted to let him continue, though with oversight detailed patient records open for review. For most of Millbrook, that was enough. Sullivan's calm cooperation, his long record of cures, weighed heavier than one man's accusation. For most people, that is. Sheriff Carmichael was not most people. And for him, the matter was far from closed. Carmichael had seen too much that night through the basement window. Robert Ricks's lifeless body was not just a tragedy, it was a spark. And for the sheriff, it marked the beginning of a quiet, relentless investigation into the true nature of the Sullivan Medical Institute. Over the months that followed, he began tracing a pattern the townspeople had never truly seen or had chosen not to see. Between 1832 and 1846, 37 patients had been admitted to Sullivan's care for what he called extended treatment. Of those, only 14 had ever returned home. 23 had died at least. According to Sullivan's records, a mortality rate that would have been scandalous had those deaths occurred among Millbrook's own. But most of the dead were not from Millbrook. They were travelers, seasonal laborers, or patients from distant towns. People whose passing could be explained in a letter without the awkward necessity of a coffin or a funeral. Families were told their loved ones had succumbed to illness during treatment, but few ever made the trip to see the truth for themselves. Digging deeper, Carmichael discovered that Sullivan had been corresponding regularly with medical colleges in Louisville, Cincinnati, and even Baltimore. The letters were not idle scholarly exchanges, they involved orders for surgical instruments, advanced anatomy texts, and quantities of supplies that far exceeded the needs of a single small-town practice. The doctor's financial ledgers told a similar story. Regular payments to unnamed suppliers, the entries disguised under terms like research materials and anatomical specimens. More troubling still was Sullivan's reach beyond Millbrook. Carmichael uncovered advertisements in newspapers from across Kentucky and southern Indiana. They spoke directly to the hopeless, the chronically ill, the mentally troubled, the forgotten cases conventional doctors had abandoned. The ads promised European medical advances, radical treatments for conditions of the mind and nerves, and a fully equipped residential facility where patients would receive constant specialized care. By the winter of 1847, the sheriff began receiving visits families from far-flung river towns, each bearing the same hollow-eyed grief. Samuel Turner, a weathered riverboat captain from Madison, Indiana, told of his 19-year-old son David, who had sunk into a deep melancholy after losing his fiancée. Local physicians could offer nothing but prayer and rest. Then Turner read Sullivan's advertisement in the Madison Courier, precisely the kind of promise a desperate father would cling to. David left for Millbrook in August 1845, expecting a 2-week stay. I got one letter. Turner said, his voice low and ragged, dictated to the doctor saying, treatment was going well but would take longer. After that, nothing. 3 times he traveled to Millbrook. 3 times Sullivan told him David was improving, but not ready for visitors. He even showed Turner letters from David, but the handwriting looked wrong, stiff, unnatural. When Turner demanded to see his son, Sullivan claimed he'd been transferred to a special facility in Louisville. Turner searched every hospital and asylum in the city. Not one had ever heard of his son. Then there was Mrs. Ellen Dawson of Bardstown. She had sent her 16-year-old daughter Catherine to Sullivan for what other doctors had called female hysteria, crushing headaches, and fainting spells that began after she'd witnessed a runaway horse trample a man in the street. Sullivan promised his neurological techniques could cure her permanently. For a time, letters came. Catherine wrote of feeling better, of learning anatomy from the doctor, even of the possibility of becoming his assistant. Mrs. Dawson's tears fell freely as she spoke. She fainted at the sight of blood, she whispered. She could never have done those things. Then, as in every story, the letters stopped. The families received the same end to their tale: their loved one had died during treatment or been moved to another facility that, upon investigation, never existed. Carmichael began to see the outline of Sullivan's design. He targeted the desperate, the far away, the ones who could disappear without the comfort or complication of a public outcry. His explanations were medically plausible. His paperwork thorough enough to discourage any but the most determined from pressing further. But the sheriff was certain of one thing. What he had glimpsed in that basement and what he was beginning to piece together now pointed to something larger and far more organized than the people of Millbrook dared imagine. The basement laboratory he had glimpsed that night was only a fragment of what might be happening within the institute's walls. The building was far larger than most in Millbrook, with more rooms and hidden spaces than its plain exterior suggested. Carmichael had come to believe there were areas no patient or town resident had ever seen, and Margaret Sullivan, pale and watchful, seemed to carry a knowledge of her father's work that she never dared to speak aloud. On a bitter February night, Carmichael returned, this time not alone. At his side was Deputy James Whitfield, steady-handed and loyal, and Dr. Augustus Brennan, a retired army surgeon who had only recently settled in Millbrook, but who had quietly voiced his unease about Sullivan's methods. They came at midnight. The building was dark, save for the familiar glow that leaked from the basement windows. Using a key Carmichael had acquired from the building's original contractor, who had mentioned that Sullivan had insisted certain doors remain service only, the 3 men slipped in through the rear entrance. The moment they crossed the threshold, Carmichael felt something was wrong in the bones of the place. The air was dense, heavy, with the sting of formaldehyde, laced with a deeper, fouler odor. organic, unmistakably mortal. The wooden floors bore dark stains that no amount of scrubbing had erased. And from somewhere below came the sounds a metallic scrape, the faint clink of glass, and more chilling, still low voices, muffled but urgent. Dr. Brennan examined the first floor patient rooms. Each was outfitted not for healing, but for confinement. Iron manacles were bolted into the walls. The windows were barred, their hinges designed to open only from the outside. The beds were fitted with thick leather straps meant to hold a body completely still. "These aren't treatment rooms," Brennan murmured, his face drawn. "They're cells." In Sullivan's office, Carmichael found a locked cabinet. Inside lay patient files that stripped away any illusion of ordinary medical work. The records contained not just clinical notes but anatomical drawings, precise measurements of bone, and descriptions of experiments, ranging from organ removal to what Sullivan termed cerebral mapping, performed in some cases while the patient was conscious. Robert Ricks's file alone ran to 17 pages, each one recording surgical interventions in unnerving detail. Which areas of the brain had been touched, which had been cut, how his speech altered, how his pain changed. Sullivan had mapped not just anatomy, but the geography of human suffering. Then Carmichael found a file unlike the others. Its label read, "Primary Research Assistant. Subject M." It was Margaret Sullivan. The notes made it clear she was not simply her father's helper. Since her arrival in Millbrook, she had been his experiment cut, altered, dosed, and studied. There were sketches of scars on her body, records of her responses to strange compounds, and chilling outlines of future procedures. Sullivan was shaping her into something precise, something useful, something no longer entirely his daughter. Deputy Whitfield's voice broke the silence. He had found a hidden door. Behind a bookshelf, its hinges soundless when opened to reveal a narrow stair curling downward. They descended into air, thick with chemicals each step, bringing sharper clarity to the noises below. And then they entered the basement. What they saw there would alter their understanding of evil forever. The lab occupied the entire basement of the Sullivan Medical Center, divided into several rooms connected by narrow, dim corridors. The main room, the operating room, had 4 operating tables, each attached to a fixture to keep patients immobile, and was surrounded by glass cases filled with preserved human body parts. On the walls were anatomical maps covered in symbols, numbering each body region with meticulous notes on the optimal surgical approach to each organ. In the storage room, Sheriff Carmichael counted 43 glass jars each containing a human body part suspended in a chemical solution. Many were labeled with the date and the patient's initials, a chilling record of Sullivan's surgical practice over the past 15 years. Some contained entire limbs, while others contained livers, lungs, or hearts that had been cut open to reveal their internal structures. What sent a chill down everyone's spine labels, showing that Sullivan had taken organs from living patients for research. Most terrifying was the room he called the Neuroscience Laboratory. Inside were 12 human heads perfectly preserved in large glass jars with detailed diagrams of how he had approached and marked each brain region. The preservation was so sophisticated that the faces were still intact enough to recognize some of the victims from descriptions by relatives. David Turner's distinctive cleft chin, Catherine Dawson's jet black hair, all were now just exhibits for the mad experiment. Dr. Brennan was looking through his notebook when footsteps sounded on the stairs behind them. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan appeared holding an oil lamp, wearing the same blood-stained leather apron that Carmichael had seen through the window months ago. Margaret Sullivan followed, walking with an odd gait, too precise, almost mechanical, as if her father's operations had compromised her ability to move. "I am disappointed, gentlemen," Sullivan said calmly, setting the lamp on the operating table. "I had hoped that Sheriff Carmichael's initial curiosity could be dealt with in the usual way, but it seems more direct measures are needed." Margaret stepped forward, blocking the exit. Her movements were smooth but lifeless, like a puppet being manipulated by invisible strings. Sullivan continued, his voice calm and lecture-like. "You have seen all my work and you are probably experiencing the usual emotional reactions: shock, disgust, outrage. But please understand, everything here is for the advancement of medical knowledge, for the benefit of humanity. Every patient who has contributed to this research has contributed to discoveries that will help relieve suffering for generations to come." Carmichael's eyes fell on the tray of surgical instruments next to him: scalpels, bone saws, forceps, and other bizarre instruments that no medical school would legally use. Deputy Whitfield spoke up, his voice calm. "These people come to you for help. They trust you." Sullivan's eyes lit up as if he had heard a compliment. "And that is the greatest belief. Medical schools only give me dead bodies, cold flesh that tells nothing about the mechanics of life. But my patients, they bring something priceless, the opportunity to observe the human body nerves and psyche in a living state." He approached a jar, the oil lamp shining on the organ, floating inside. "This liver belongs to a 43-year-old farmer who complained of chronic fatigue. Do you dare to stay in this cellar for another minute? Comment what you would do if you were in Sheriff Carmichael's shoes." If this story gives you chills, don't forget to like and share so everyone can discover the darkness hidden behind Sullivan Medical Institute. Sullivan lifted the glass jar, the light of the oil lamp shining through the murky liquid, revealing the intact liver inside. His voice was even and proud. "Through meticulous surgical exploration, while the patient was still conscious, I mapped the relationship between liver function and body energy levels with unprecedented precision. His contributions to medicine far exceed any achievements that ordinary farm work can bring." Dr. Brennan took a step forward, trying to stay calm. "Dr. Sullivan, what you're talking about is not medical research. This is systematic torture. They have suffered unimaginable, terrible pain." Sullivan curled his lips slightly. "Ah, Dr. Brennan, your military medical background has shown you many tragic scenes, but you have never studied them. Pain is just a neurological response which can be adjusted through proper intervention. Let's see." He gestured to Margaret. She immediately rolled up her sleeves, revealing a series of surgical scars running down her arm. Sullivan picked up a small scalpel, gently making an incision in the same scar. Margaret didn't blink. Not a single groan, not a single frown. By rewiring the nerve pathways and applying specialized chemicals, I have completely eliminated Margaret's ability to feel pain while preserving her cognitive function. She is the product of 15 years of neurological research, a perfect medical assistant performing complex surgery without the limitations of trivial emotions. Margaret spoke calmly as if reciting. The first procedures were uncomfortable, but my father explained that this was necessary for optimal performance. Now, I can support long-term surgical research without being affected by emotions, ensuring scientific objectivity. Sheriff Carmichael suddenly realized before them was a girl whose father had robbed her of her ability to feel a medical machine in human skin. Sullivan grew more and more enthusiastic. What Margaret showed was just the beginning. I have developed techniques to remove specific emotional responses while preserving intelligence, to raise pain thresholds, and to radically alter personality traits that society considers undesirable. He led them to another area where the surgical tables were far more sophisticated. Each table had mechanisms to precisely control the patient's position and equipment to monitor vital signs during lengthy surgeries. David Turner, a young man from Madison with melancholia, has given me extraordinary insights into the neurological basis of sadness. Sullivan opened a leather-bound notebook, its thick handwriting. By exploring each region of the brain, I identified the neural pathways that caused the depression and intervened to permanently eliminate them. Dr. Brennan clenched his fists, his voice shaking with anger. "You mean you operated on a conscious patient? I call it neuro-optimization," Sullivan said simply. "And of course, consciousness is necessary. How would I know which interventions were successful without direct feedback?" Sullivan said, his eyes sparkling as if he was showing off an invention. David remained conscious throughout the procedure, reporting every change in his mind as I tweaked each region of his brain. His contribution to neuroscience is priceless. By this time, Deputy Whitfield had quietly begun to inspect the corners of the lab. In a small room hidden behind a curtain that smelled heavily of chemicals, he stopped. "Sheriff," his voice was low and cold, "you need to see this. Inside are living patients lying motionless on the operating table, their bodies in various stages of reformation. If it were you, would you immediately rescue them or try to capture Sullivan first? Leave a comment and share this video so everyone can know the horrifying truth in the basement of the Sullivan Medical Institute." Stepping through the curtain that smelled of antiseptic, Sheriff Carmichael and his colleagues froze. In the sealed room, 6 patients lay motionless on the operating table, their heads partially shaved, their fresh surgical wounds carefully bandaged. Each was tied tightly with leather straps, their eyes wide open, following every movement in the room. Their gazes filled with terror but unable to utter a single cry for help. Their vocal cords had been tampered with, leaving only intermittent grunts. Sullivan stepped forward, a smile of pride on his face. "Ah, you found my current group of research subjects. They're a fascinating study of progressive neurotransmission, each undergoing a different experimental protocol testing hypotheses about consciousness, pain perception, and behavioral control." He approached the first table, glanced at the note tied to the rope. "This man came in 3 weeks ago, complaining of chronic insomnia. I have been directly involved in the sleep center to see if I can eliminate the need for sleep. The initial results are promising, although there have been some unexpected cognitive side effects." The middle-aged man tried to speak, but only a weak, choked sound came out. Sullivan moved on to the second table, where a young woman lay motionless. This woman came in because of her extreme anxiety. I am studying the possibility of eliminating the fear response by surgically activating the amygdala while leaving the other emotions intact. The process will require many adjustments, but I believe it is close to success. Sheriff Carmichael felt his heart sink. These were not just the remains of past victims. They were witnessing live torture taking place right now. Margaret walked over to another table, quietly tightening the patient's restraints, her hands moving as skillfully as if she were arranging medical instruments. There was no hesitation, no sympathy. Sullivan said proudly, "Margaret is invaluable in long-term research. She can monitor vital signs, maintain incisions, and assist in surgery without being emotionally involved." That's the future of medicine doctors focused on research, not bound by emotional frailty. Dr. Brennan bent over a young woman whose eyes were wide and pleading, though her body was immobile. The incisions crisscrossing her skull showed that she had undergone multiple surgeries. His voice cracked. "How long have you kept them here?" Sullivan opened the book, his voice gleeful. "The longest serving participant has been in the study for nearly 8 months. This case is especially valuable because I can observe the long-term effects of progressive neuroengineering, step-by-step changes in personality and cognition, and map the effects of surgical intervention on human consciousness." Brennan glanced at the patient in front of her. She was in her early 20s, with dark hair and delicate features once beautiful before Sullivan's operations had deformed her skull. The plaque hanging above the bed read N61, Catherine. Sullivan spoke again, his tone like a scientific paper. "Catherine came in for migraines, but this is the perfect opportunity to study pain perception. I've tested every nerve pathway determining how to eliminate specific types of pain while leaving the other senses intact. Her contributions will help countless patients in the future reduce their pain. If you were in Sheriff Carmichael's shoes right now, would you immediately save them or try to capture Sullivan alive to bring him to justice? Leave a comment and share the video so more people know this terrible truth." Catherine stared, her eyes bright with a clear awareness of where she was, what was happening, and a desperate need to call for help. But Sullivan's surgeries had destroyed her ability to control her facial muscles and vocal cords. She heard and saw everything, but she was trapped in a body that no longer obeyed her. Sheriff Carmichael felt his stomach twist. This was more than just murder. Sullivan kept his patients alive as long as possible, then cut into their brains step by step, creating victims who remained conscious while their ability to function as normal humans was slowly destroyed. Sullivan leisurely picked up the surgical instruments, his voice mumbling as if he were reading a blueprint. "You three are truly a rare research opportunity. Sheriff Carmichael, your experience as a community leader will help me figure out the neural mechanisms of authority and decision-making. I'm particularly interested in knowing if surgery can enhance leadership while removing pesky moral barriers." He walked toward Deputy Whitfield, his eyes scrutinizing him as if he were evaluating a experimental specimen. "And you, a police officer with great stamina and stress tolerance, ideal for studying pain thresholds and behavioral control under extreme conditions." Dr. Brennan instinctively retreated, but Margaret quickly blocked her escape, each move cold and precise. It was clear that Sullivan wasn't just teaching her medical techniques, he was also training her as a lab guard. Dr. Brennan Sullivan turned his voice, almost lecturing. Your military medical background would be perfect for research into improving battlefield medical efficiency. Imagine a medic who could treat horrific injuries without being moved by the pain of his comrades. No empathy, no fear. Only focused on the mission. That was Sullivan's vision of medicine. Doctors stripped of their humanity, willing to perform any procedure as long as it had scientific value. When Sheriff Carmichael tried to rush toward the door, Margaret reacted like a fighting machine. She used her own medical instruments as weapons, striking cleanly without flinching. Every move was the result of years of training to see violence as part of science. Dr. Brennan tried to free Catherine, but her body was barely able to coordinate. Her altered nervous system had left her conscious but immobile, a living hell. Sullivan fought back, furiously beating and continuing to talk about the value of research. Even when he was restrained, he was still frustrated that the intellectually inferior could not understand the magnitude of the invention, asserting that the future would recognize him as the father of true scientific medicine. "You are destroying 15 years of unprecedented research," Sullivan shouted as Deputy Whitfield locked his arms. "These subjects have contributed more to neuroscience than anyone in history. Future generations will honor this work." Margaret was also restrained, but her reaction made everyone shudder. Not fear, not anger, not despair. She calmly observed the situation began, calculating how to continue her father's work from memory. Sullivan succeeded, erased emotions, kept his intelligence and medical skills intact. If it were you facing a doctor like Sullivan and an assistant like Margaret, would you choose to kill them on the spot or capture them alive to bring them to court? Leave a comment share so everyone can see the dark side of this science. The comprehensive investigation into the Sullivan Medical Institute involved local police, state and federal agencies and top medical experts from regional universities. The sophistication of the operation far exceeded any previous case. It was not simply a medical crime, but a systematic web of torture that required specialized knowledge to fully understand the extent of the crimes and the trauma to the victims. Dr. Marcus Fitzgerald, a leading neuroscientist at the University of Louisville, spent 3 weeks poring over Sullivan's research notebooks trying to decipher the surgical techniques he had invented. Fitzgerald's preliminary report described it as a full-scale experiment on the human brain, demonstrating both advanced medical expertise and a complete disregard for patient welfare. The final tally of victims, 89 people ranging in age from 14 to 67, from Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee, and even Illinois and Virginia. It turned out that Sullivan's advertising campaign was more extensive than he had imagined, reaching all over the Ohio River, attracting patients from far and wide, making it difficult for his family to keep up. Sullivan's diary revealed 17 years of research that began with novel medical methods, then spiraled into torture disguised as research. Each sick success spurred him to go further, building a whole system of hunting and managing victims. Forged letters to make families believe patients were fine. Forged patients' own handwriting. Procedures for handling bodies when experimental specimens died. This was not just madness, but a cold, calculating mind. Of the 6 patients found alive, only 3 were able to receive treatment from the real doctors. Their brain damage was too severe to be reversed, but their testimonies were living proof of Sullivan's brutality. Catherine Morrison, The young woman who came to her for a migraine lived for 6 weeks after her rescue. In her lucid moments, she wrote a horrifying account. He cut open my head while I was conscious, repeatedly probing each area of my brain and asking me to describe the sensations. When I cried and begged, he told me that my emotions were corrupting scientific objectivity. He said the pain was temporary and the knowledge would save humanity. Catherine said Sullivan used a combination of mechanical restraints and drugs to keep patients conscious, fully aware, but unable to resist or flee. This allowed him to perform surgeries that lasted weeks, even months, gradually intervening in areas of brain function and meticulously recording the results. Thomas Beckwith, a 34-year-old miller from Brandenburg who came to him for chronic back pain, survived with only partial consciousness. In his testimony, Thomas wrote, he said that current medicine only treats symptoms and that his method could eliminate pain permanently by changing the brain's response. Every operation, he said, would be his last. But then there was another area he wanted to test, another theory to test. I realized he never wanted to fix my back. I was just a tool to study how the brain feels pain. If you're watching this video, try to imagine. What would you do if you knew that a loved one of yours had been in Sullivan's hands? Share your answer so that everyone can understand that this crime is not just a horror story. It can happen right next to us. The third survivor, Elizabeth Harden, 17 of Owensboro, was brought to the Sullivan Institute by her parents for treatment of persistent melancholia. In her testimony, Elizabeth revealed a chilling truth. Sullivan was particularly interested in younger patients because their brain tissue was more plastic, able to withstand surgeries that would have killed older patients. In shaky but clear notes, Elizabeth recounted sitting in front of Sullivan as he operated on people's brains while he explained his theories of emotional regulation and personality restructuring. According to Sullivan, sadness and fear were simply technical flaws in the brain and could be fixed with neurosurgery. He believed he could create people who never felt negative emotions perfectly optimized for society. The case of Margaret Sullivan. Sullivan's daughter presented the greatest challenge to doctors and investigators. Dr. Fitzgerald's examination revealed that over the years, Sullivan had performed a series of operations on his daughter's brain and nervous system, fundamentally altering her neurological function in ways that modern medicine could not reverse or fully understand. Miss Margaret is the most extensive, systematic neurological modification ever documented, Dr. Fitzgerald reported to the court. Her father transformed her into an entity that retained her intellect and motor abilities but was completely devoid of the normal emotions that govern moral behavior. Margaret's testimony provided the fullest picture of Sullivan's research methods. But with her altered state of mind, she recounted the gruesome scenes in a monotone, emotionless voice, not recognizing the crime as a crime, but as legitimate medical research. My father began altering my neurological responses when I was about 8 years old, she said. At first, the goal was to eliminate pain and anxiety so that I could be a more effective research assistant. Then he continued to eliminate emotions that would interfere with scientific objectivity, such as compassion or guilt about the experimental procedures. Margaret helped tie up patients, monitor their vitals, while her father operated on them and even dispose of their bodies when their experimental specimens died. All as part of her daily routine. The 8-month trial of Sullivan, with hundreds of shocking testimonies, forced the law to consider unprecedented questions. Can a medical experiment performed by a licensed physician be considered murder? And if the crime was disguised as science, what would the punishment be? Sullivan's defense attorney argued that his client had no criminal intent, but was simply overindulged in science. But throughout the trial, Sullivan showed no remorse. On the contrary, he saw this as an opportunity to defend his research. The participants in this study have advanced humanity's understanding of neurological function in ways that conventional medicine could never achieve, Sullivan declared in his final statement. Their sacrifices will be vindicated when future physicians use this knowledge to relieve the suffering of countless patients. If you're listening to this, do you believe that Sullivan really thought of himself as a benefactor to humanity? Or is this just the self-justification of someone who has completely lost his moral compass? Let us know what you think, because the answer will reveal how we perceive the line between science and evil. The jury found Sullivan guilty of 87 counts of first-degree murder, making it one of the largest serial killer trials in US legal history. The judge sentenced him to death. In the final months of his life, Sullivan spent time writing a memoir that was more than 400 pages long, meticulously documenting his research methods and expressing his hope that future scientists would continue his work. But instead of inspiring science, the memoirs became additional evidence exposing how he found victims and turned them into living experiments. In his files, Sullivan also kept a detailed expense report payments to suppliers of chemicals, surgical instruments, and medical equipment throughout the region. Correspondence with suppliers in Louisville, Cincinnati, Baltimore, and even New York. The chilling revelation was that many of the purchases were unusual for a small-town doctor, leading investigators to wonder, were some people aware of the true purpose and still helping? When investigators reviewed Sullivan's correspondence, they discovered that he had been in academic discussions with other doctors across the United States. He shared some of his research but kept his methods of data collection secret. Some of the letters suggested that other doctors were also conducting illegal experiments, leading the investigation to go national. The results were shocking. At least 3 other doctors were suspected of conducting illegal experiments on patients. Dr. Edmund Forrester Nashville, who corresponded regularly with Sullivan, purchased similar equipment and chemicals. When authorities searched his office, they found preserved human organs and surgical notes indicating that he may have experimented on both dead and living people. Dr. William Chandler. Lexington received detailed instructions from Sullivan on the neuroadjustment technique. His medical records showed an unusually high mortality rate in cases that were otherwise mild. The clinic was closed for investigation, but Chandler died of a heart attack before he could be prosecuted. Dr. Harrison Blackstone Louisville discussed with Sullivan the optimization of nerve function through surgery. He ran a private clinic advertising the treatment of mental and neurological disorders and took patients from several states. During the investigation, police discovered evidence of similar experiments as Sullivan, only more cleverly concealed. Records showed that many patients underwent unnecessary surgeries, more theoretical experiments than treatments for the underlying disease. This discovery led to a chilling conclusion. Sullivan was not alone. He may be a link in a network of doctors who use the name of medicine to conduct illegal human experiments, hiding right in the heart of the medical profession. As you listen to this story, the biggest question you may have is no longer, what did Sullivan do, but how many doctors are out there, still doing the same thing, but have not been discovered? Margaret Sullivan, his daughter, spent the rest of her life in the Kentucky State Asylum. There, doctors struggled to understand the extent of her father's brain surgery. The hospital's director, Dr. Samuel Patterson, brought in experts from several universities to study Margaret's condition and find a treatment for victims of similar experiments. The medical report said Sullivan's brain modifications almost completely eliminated normal emotional responses, but preserved memory and thinking ability. Margaret could describe medical procedures in detail, even perform complex skills, but she could not understand why her actions were considered wrong. Margaret lived until 1903, never to develop normal emotions again. Yet throughout her life, she provided valuable information for neuroscience, and she also served as a warning about how medical knowledge can be twisted for evil. The Sullivan Medical Institute burned down in March 1847. Locals said the basement laboratory was nearly indestructible. Sullivan's preservative chemicals caused the fire to burn with strange colors and created toxic fumes that forced the evacuation of the entire town. After the fire, the land remained a dead zone. The chemicals seeped deep into the soil. No plants or trees could grow. Animals stayed away. The government banned any construction or use of the site. For the victims' families, the pain was compounded when they read Sullivan's meticulous notes, a precise description of each experiment their loved one underwent. Many families moved out of town, unable to bear the thought of seeing those who believed and defended him. Captain Samuel Turner, the father of one of his victims, spent the rest of his life lobbying for patient protection legislation. His speech before the Kentucky legislature helped create the approval of experimental medical procedures, the mandatory reporting of all patient deaths. The Kentucky Medical Board used Sullivan's case as a model for a new medical oversight system, which became the foundation for modern medical ethics. But all details of Sullivan's methods were sealed in archives for more than 100 years to prevent others from imitating them. The town of Millbrook never recovered. The population plummeted. Main Street was deserted. The grounds of the old hospital remained stained with no vegetation growing. People told of strange smells, unexplained noises, and a sense of unease when they approached. Although they may have been psychological, the stories left the place abandoned, becoming a dark corner of the Kentucky map. The Sullivan case showed that professional reputation and community trust can be exploited to cover up crimes. Lack of oversight and poor information systems allowed the crime to last for nearly 2 decades. Modern medical historians see this as a painful lesson that led to informed consent procedures for patients, medical review boards, strict regulations on human medical research. Now, the question for you: do you think Sullivan's secrets have been revealed? Or have other doctors followed suit and continued the same terrible work in the dark? Leave a comment. Share your theories about this dark chapter in the history of American medicine. If you love historical horror stories, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share it with those who love dark mysteries. See you in the next video, where the darkness of the past still holds secrets that no one dares to touch.